In the Queen City, Boomer Von Cannon, WBT.
Hi. It's 5:04 and welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start with some breaking news this morning out of the North Carolina's, out of the Capitol, the legislature, and the soon-to-be governor's mansion for Josh Stein. Governor-elect Josh Stein, and outgoing Governor Roy Cooper, both Democrats, have filed a lawsuit to block parts of Senate Bill 382. That was a law passed by the Republican-controlled legislature that restructures the State Highway Patrol and removes it from the governor's oversight. This piece of legislation, of course, we spent a lot of time talking about it this week. It adds an additional $220+ million to hurricane relief out of course, western North Carolina with the devastation from Hurricane Helene. It moves the State Board of Elections from the under the authority and purview of the governor to the state auditor's office. And in this case, it also restructures the State Highway Patrol and removes it from the governor's oversight. The law enacted after overriding of Cooper's veto earlier this week establishes the SHP commander as a cabinet-level position appointed by the legislature and protected from removal by the governor until 2030. In their lawsuit, that being Cooper and Stein, the suit is called Stein v. Moore, which was filed in Wake County Superior Court last night around 6 o'clock. Stein and Cooper argue that the law is unconstitutional. They also argue that it undermines public safety and disrupts the chain of command during emergencies. They contend that the changes infringe on executive powers, compromise accountability, and hinder effective crisis response. The lawsuit names House Speaker Tim Moore, Senate Leader Phil Berger, and SHP Commander Freddie Johnson as the defendants. The disrupted provisions grant Johnson, appointed by Cooper in 2021, authority over state law enforcement and emergency services until 2030, barring extraordinary circumstances. Stein and Cooper claim this arrangement prevents the governor from ensuring that SHP's alignment is within state priorities, even in cases of misconduct. They seek a court ruling declaring the law unconstitutional and an injunction to block its implementation. As I mentioned, this is just one small portion of Senate Bill 382, and this is likely the first of many lawsuits that we will see over some of the pieces in this 132-page piece of legislation that was overridden by the General Assembly, the House, back on Wednesday. So that is our breaking news that we are tracking this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. You can read more on these details. We've got a fresh story up this morning over at carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:07, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We have talked a lot about the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency over the last couple of weeks. NCORR is their acronym, NCORR. And to get an update this morning, Teresa Opeka from CarolinaJournal.com is our guest this morning on the News Hour. Teresa, NCORR has not been in the positive spotlight now for a couple of years, and you've got a story out this morning that indicates that things are continuing to struggle for them. What are you tracking?
Yes. Good morning, Nick. Thanks so much. So it's facing more questions right now. NCORR is a report surfaced earlier this week that it showed that it ordered contractors to stop building new homes for Hurricane Florence and Matthew victims, and they also stopped paying contractors who were in the middle of construction on homes for those victims as well. So it's just been a very embattled agency. You know, recently we had a hearing at Government Ops, had the hearing with the former director, Laura Hogshead. They're in the hole $221 million. So I guess this comes as no surprise that they're ordering stoppage on construction and not paying contractors. I did have an emailed statement from the office. The spokesperson got back to me. They did say that, yeah, they are putting a pause on work orders for new construction, but they didn't really come out and agree or actually say that they stopped paying contractors at this point.
Well, that's very interesting, Teresa. We remember back to a hearing that took place a couple of weeks ago, and the former director, who has now left her position, which, by the way, we still don't know whether Laura Hogshead was fired or asked to leave of her post as the head of NCOR. But this question was brought up by lawmakers about them being behind, and she made it very clear at the time, 3 weeks ago, that things were still chugging along, that they had money to pay contractors. So to me, this was a pretty shocking headline when I saw it.
Yeah, it definitely is. But, I've been covering these hearings. I think it's the last 2 years they've been having them, and it's kind of like wash, rinse, repeat. Because they'll have her, before a hearing, and it's the same story from her, like, oh, well, yep, I know we're behind in building houses, and then, the money's going to run out in 2025, 2026, because that's what the federal government gave for Matthew and Florence recovery. And, but I take responsibility, but we're moving along, and, this kind of stuff. It was the same thing over and over. And then lawmakers would ask her, hey, if you worked in the private sector, or actually asked her, they told her, if you worked in the private sector, you'd be fired by now, or I would fire you. It was the same thing over and over again for the last couple of years. And, they even had South Carolina was so much further ahead in their recovery and rebuilding efforts. They had somebody there they actually started to work with them and thought, okay, things are going to be fixed. So, but the last couple of years, it's been like kicking the can down the road as far as this is concerned, as far as the legislature is concerned. So, yeah, it's a surprise, but it's not a surprise, I would say.
Well, and we'll get back to the politics of this in a minute, but you've still got thousands of families that need help. And again, we're not talking about impacts from Hurricane Helene. We're talking about two storms, Matthew and Florence, that affected the eastern half of the state. So now with this apparent work stoppage, no more work orders being put out, do we have any idea as to when this is going to restart, or when some of these folks are going to get the relief that they have applied for and have been approved for from the state?
I'm not sure. I mean, like you mentioned, there's still 1,400 homes pending construction. There's 766 families that are currently in the rebuilding process nearly a decade later. I mean, they're all still waiting. As you mentioned, Hurricane Helene just happened, and that's tragic. And this is just going to add to that. They were coming up with a new committee to oversee all of this. So I don't have actually a time frame for all of this, but they were going to be, setting up this new committee. And in fact, I think they maybe met earlier this week to actually go over some new parameters, new auditing procedures when it comes to this. And like you say, with the override of Governor Cooper's veto on Wednesday of SB Senate Bill 382, it does give an additional $50 million to NCOR. So that's going to help somewhat, but it still doesn't make up for the gaping hole that's left.
Now, obviously, we'll continue to track the progress for those folks in eastern North Carolina that have been unfortunately having to deal with the slow process of bureaucracy here with NCOR. But I think, Teresa, the larger question that everybody's probably asking themselves is this same entity going to be responsible for the devastation out west? Of reports we're hearing, it's going to be upwards of $50 billion worth of damage in western North Carolina. And I think it's a fair assumption to say that folks don't have confidence that NCOR is going to be capable of doing the work.
Exactly. So, yeah, I believe that they are. We had a story yesterday. So there was a House Committee on Helene Recovery. They actually set that up. And what it looks like, that they are going to continue committee work into the 2025-26 biennium, and they're going to be working on disaster recovery. So they're setting up a new arm, if you will, of government to oversee all of this. Also, interesting enough, too, I had another story yesterday that there was an audit by Jessica Holmes, the state auditor, that Department of Public Safety, which oversees NCOR, they failed to implement procedures and monitor spending of Hurricane Florence Recovery Fund. So that's another story that you could take a look at. So they're not sure where, they weren't keeping track of where the money was going. It's just a huge, huge mess. And like you say, the human element in all of this is people are still waiting for homes nearly a decade later. And with Helene on top of it, it's unreal, and it's uncalled for these people.
It's a miserable situation. We'll continue the conversation with Teresa Opeka. We'll talk a little bit about this Department of Public Safety audit coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for a look at traffic on this Friday the 13th with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good Friday.
your emergency situation station.
It's 5:20. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. If you miss any portion of the show, I invite you to check out our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour or visit WBT.com and hover over the podcast tab. And some other news that we're tracking this morning across the state, enrollment in traditional public schools has declined nationally and in North Carolina, with national figures dropping by 2.5% since 2019 and North Carolina seeing a 1% decrease. This trend occurs despite significant population growth in the state. The COVID-19 pandemic back in the early parts of 2020 did accelerate these changes as families sought alternatives like private schools, charter schools, and homeschooling to address health, academic, and logistical concerns. Nationally, pre-K through 8th grade saw a 4.5% enrollment decline, while high school enrollment rose by 2%. In North Carolina, charter schools experienced a 12% enrollment increase, 12% between 2019 and 2022, adding over 14,000 additional students. The state has now approximately 146,000 charter students, supported by a growing number of schools to meet those demands. And I'll note that, of course, charter schools are public schools in North Carolina. Private schools also saw a 3.2% annual increase, with over 131,000 students enrolled in the 23-24 school year, driven partially by programs like Opportunity Scholarships, or OPSs, which offer financial assistance to families that need them. Wake County leads private school enrollment with more than 22,000 students, and homeschooling has grown as well, with 157,000 plus students in North Carolina, and those families choosing that as their option in the 23-24 school year. That's a 3% increase from the previous year. Families are attracted to its flexibility and tailored approach to learning. Educational leaders emphasize that the shift highlights a desire for more diverse and personalized education options. Policymakers face challenges in adapting to these trends, which carry implications for budget and student outcomes as we continue to follow the work of the North Carolina General Assembly. There was a lot of hay made this session about expanding the Opportunity Scholarship Program, fully funding all of the students and families that were on the OPS wait list. That was done by the General Assembly back parts of last month. So that is going to continue. We'll likely continue to see the decline in public schools and the continued increase in things like private schools, public charter schools, and of course homeschooling, if that's the option that families choose. It's now 5:23, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Continuing our discussion this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, Teresa Opeka from CarolinaJournal.com joins us. We were talking about NCORE, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and she mentioned the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. DPS is the acronym that you're probably familiar with. Teresa, you've got a story up on that this morning over at CarolinaJournal.com. NCORE is actually under DPS, and there's apparently some audit issues with them. What's going on there?
Sure. So State Auditor Jessica Holmes released the report yesterday that found that the DPS, Department of Public Safety, they didn't design or implement procedures to make sure Hurricane Florence recovery funds were actually spent according to the legislation with the same name, or if they actually got the results they were supposed to be getting. So it's just another report on top of NCORE. Like you say, they and DPS oversees NCORE. So this goes, the oversight goes from February 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2023. They actually had another audit back in April of 2022. They found similar results. This audit, it found that $18 million of Hurricane Florence disaster recovery funds that went to other recipients had limited monitoring, and $94 million of the same funds went to recipients without ensuring they had an actual method to measure the results, seeing where it actually went to. Now, you combine both of those. The first that I said, that was $520 million funds that have gone out to recipients without monitoring or very limited monitoring. The total on the other, that without the method to monitor, is $877 million. I mean, if you worked in the private sector, you'd be fired, right? You're not monitoring all this.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to transition into. And as you mentioned in the previous segment, and as we've played clips before from the General Assembly and their oversight hearings with NCOR, I mean, the dollar amounts that we're talking about, we'll even take the smallest dollar amount here, Teresa, and at $18 million, at reading your story, dispersed with limited monitoring, meaning that potentially this money was not used in an appropriate manner for hurricane relief. That's almost unbelievable to think.
Oh, it is, absolutely. I mean, they're like, they want to make sure that it's actually going out correctly. They didn't have anything, what should have been included, like invoices, receipts, payroll records, to make sure everything matched up. And, and DPS actually came back, and that's Eddie Buffalo Jr., who oversees DPS. He says they told auditors that they didn't independently verify spending because legislation didn't specifically require them to do that. That auditors came back and said, no, it was required. I mean, it was a back and forth. Basically, bottom line, DPS disagreed, and Auditor Holmes' office said, no, all this was a requirement. You should have followed it. So.
Yeah, and with that, as again, we look at this story, we look at some of the other relief that's going to have to take place in Western North Carolina. I mean, Teresa, this is not something where you could throw a blanket over it and say, well, this is a general government issue. We've seen our neighboring states, specifically those folks down in South Carolina, that had very similar damage and destruction from Matthew and Florence in their state. Not only have they gotten all those folks back in their homes, the department that did it no longer exists because, well, all the work was completed years and years ago compared to what's going on here in North Carolina, something just separated, at least in the Charlotte area, by just a couple of miles.
Right, exactly. It's like the precursor to Doge, right, for Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy,
Sure.
How that department's supposed to disappear, when they figure out where the wasteful spending is. Yeah, I mean, look what they did. And now that they finished, they completed it. And like you said, people are back in their homes. And if South Carolina can do it, why can't North Carolina do it? So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But as we mentioned before the break, you feel badly for all these people. It's like, they're the ones suffering in all of this. And it just goes back and forth, kicking the can down the road, politics, whatever, regardless. People are still suffering years later. And now you got the Hurricane Helene victims on top of it. So hopefully this does get straightened out this year with this new committee that the legislature, I believe the House, has got set up, and hoping for the best for that. But we all have to keep our eyes on that and keep a watch over it.
Let's end on that. Obviously, Josh Stein is set to become the governor coming up here in just a couple of weeks. He'll be sworn in. The new Republican legislature, which will be a majority, not a supermajority, but a majority controlled by the Republicans. And the incoming state auditor is Dave Bolick, also a Republican. Teresa, this is probably going to be a big issue for the Stein administration to deal with on day one. Do you think there's going to be a lot more pressure on this as we go for not only in the months, but years to come as this relief continues in Eastern and now Western North Carolina?
I believe so. I know Dave Bolick said he was looking forward to doing a couple different things, including, getting off topic here for a moment about having powers over the state election board. So I think he's going to be a very watchful eye over this when it comes to this situation. And as far as Josh Stein is concerned, I think the pressure is going to be on him more than maybe he thinks at the moment. Also, too, from the federal government, stay tuned from that too, because you don't know with the way President-elect Trump has been speaking and what he's like they joke he's already taken office. Wait and see what happens. But yeah, I think the pressure is going to be on the Stein administration.
A great update this morning. You can read more on Teresa Opeka's story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, Nick, in Uptown, we have a hit and run.
and 99.3 WBT. Like a 50,000 watt Yule log all year long.
537 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour. My name is Nick Craig. Good Friday morning to you. Our breaking news this morning: North Carolina Governor-elect Josh Stein, as well as outgoing Governor Roy Cooper, both Democrats, have now filed a lawsuit to block parts of Senate Bill 382. This was a piece of legislation passed by the Republican-controlled legislature that restructures the State Highway Patrol and removes it from the governor's oversight. The legislation also adds more than $220 million additional dollars to hurricane relief out in western North Carolina, bringing that statewide total to over $1 billion as we sit here this morning. It moves the State Board of Elections out from under the governor's purview and over to the state auditor, which will soon to be Dave Bullock, a Republican. He won his election back last month. He'll be sworn into that office in parts of January. And, well, we expected some lawfare about Senate Bill 382, and we got that first bit of it last night. The law, enacted after overriding Governor Roy Cooper's veto, establishes the SHP commander as a cabinet-level position appointed by the legislature and protected from removal by the governor until 2030. In their lawsuit, Stein v. Moore, which was filed in Wake County Superior Court, Stein and Cooper argue that the law is unconstitutional, undermines public safety, and disrupts the chain of command during emergencies. They contend that the changes infringe on executive powers, compromise accountability, and hinder effective crisis response. The lawsuit names House Speaker Tim Moore, Senate Leader Phil Berger, and SHP Commander Freddie Johnson as defendants. The disrupted provisions grant Johnson, appointed by Cooper in 2021, authority over state law enforcement and emergency services until 2030, barring extraordinary circumstances. Stein and Cooper claim this arrangement prevents the governor from ensuring that SHP is in alignment with the priorities of the governor, even in cases of misconduct. They seek a court ruling declaring the law unconstitutional and an injunction blocking its implementation. As I mentioned, this is the first of likely many legal battles over Senate Bill 382. We'll continue to keep an eye on those. It is currently our top story. You can read more details and view the full lawsuit this morning over on our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:39, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Cybersecurity and hacking is a big conversation piece. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the government or private business. It is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in which individuals steal data, compromise various personal bits of information, and it's a big deal, and it affects government as well. To get some more details on a letter that was sent by U.S. Senator Thom Tillis, it's my pleasure to welcome Katie Zender back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning. Katie, it seems like you can't go by a day in the news without some sort of cyber threat, some website, some service getting compromised, and Tillis has got some words now that he's sending to the FBI. What are you tracking on that this morning?
Right. Good morning, Nick. It's so good to be back. Yeah. So Trump's nominee for director of the FBI, Kash Patel, has actually been targeted by some cyber attacks. And so Thom Tillis on Monday sent a letter to Paul Abate. He's the deputy director of the FBI, demanding answers cyber attacks on Patel. Last week, law enforcement officials told NBC News that the FBI had recently confirmed to Patel that he had been targeted by Iranian-backed cyber attacks.
Well, it's interesting that you say Iranian-backed during the presidential campaign. This was probably about maybe September or so. We heard similar things that Iranian hacking groups were also going after Trump's cell phone and folks around Trump trying to get information. So it seems like it's something that's not just necessarily something in which they're going after the president. They're going after other potentially soon-to-be high-ranking individuals like Kash Patel that will soon be leading the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Right, that's exactly right, Nikki. So yeah, exactly. Back in September, 3 Iranian operatives were allegedly working for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they were charged with leaking emails and documents to media outlets, allegedly in an effort to undermine the Trump campaign.
With that, in your story, you've got a picture, and we'll be talking a lot about Thom Tillis over the next couple of years. He is in and out of favor. It seemingly depends on the way the wind's blowing with folks in North Carolina. However, this past week, or earlier this week, I should say, he actually posted a picture on X with Kash Patel, indicating maybe that Tillis is going to be working hard with the Trump administration, with bombastic individuals like Kash, to get a lot of things done in the administration. That we'll see how that plays out.
Exactly right, Nick. Yes. So Senator Thom Tillis did post a photo on X with Kash Patel. He said, "Patel is the real deal. President Trump campaigned on the promise to enforce our laws equally and fairly and restore the integrity of the FBI. I look forward to supporting Kash Patel's confirmation." So yes, he has come out very strongly in support of Patel, and I think he's going to do everything he can to push his confirmation through the Senate. Patel also, tweeted a similar picture. It might even be the same picture, and he said it was tremendous meeting with Senator Tillis. He's a brilliant senator with great advice. Looking forward to working with him through this confirmation process.
Yeah, and Tillis is going to be at the center of a lot of this. So let's go back to this letter, and the timeline on this is rather interesting. Tillis sent this letter, and it wasn't directed to the head of the FBI, but he sent it to the FBI on Monday. We learned just a couple of days after that Christopher Wray, the current emboldened FBI director, is actually going to be leaving his position shortly here. So there's a lot of moving parts here. What exactly is Tillis requesting in that letter, and did he give any deadlines or timelines for the FBI as to what exactly he's looking for?
Right. So Tillis outlined 5 specific questions for the FBI in his letter. You can go through and read those. But yes, he demanded an answer by December 20th to respond to the questions he outlined in his letter. And yes, so the current director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, announced Wednesday to FBI Workforce that he intends to resign at the end of Biden's term in January. Had he not resigned, the only way Patel would have been confirmed to this position was for Wray to be either fired or to resign. So had this not happened, Patel would not have been, immediately transitioning into this position without Wray stepping down in some way. But Wray said in his resignation, he said, "My goal is to keep the focus on our mission, the indispensable work you're doing on behalf of the American people every day. In my view, this is the best way to avoid dragging the Bureau deeper into the fray while reinforcing the values and principles that are so important to how we do our work here." So it looks like Wray's really trying to kind of avoid any political backlashes or political draw on this, and just saying, this is the best way to kind of step down and ensure a smooth transition. And, the FBI is not always, in fact, they're usually not, when they're in the news, it's usually not for a good reason. They're kind of one of those organizations that their successes are private and their failures are very public. And so I think that he's doing his best to kind of, keep any negative news about the FBI out of the public eye.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up. And over the last couple of years, the FBI has been under a lot of scrutiny and in the news, and it's got nothing to do with necessarily the things that they're doing or not. It's got everything to do with some of the politicization inside that department and many other three-letter agencies within the federal government. It's going to be very interesting to see what Kash Patel does as the head of the FBI, and seeing if he can, at this point, probably try and resurrect the name and make folks believe it's an organization and an entity that they can probably trust again.
Right. And what's really interesting here as well, Nick, is that Wray was actually appointed to this position by Trump back in 2017 after Trump fired James Comey, the director at the time.
Yeah, obviously a lot going on here, a lot of moving pieces. Katie, thanks for the update this morning. You can read more on her story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:45, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic on this Friday morning with the great Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Dick. Thank you, sir.
WBT.
Good morning again. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Friday to you. Tracking some of our statewide news this morning, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, NCORE, you've heard them, we've talked a lot about them over the last couple of weeks now, is under additional scrutiny this morning following reports of halted construction on homes for victims of Hurricanes Florence and Matthew, alongside a pause in current contractor payment for work that has, in some cases, already been done. The agency, which was established by Democrat Governor Roy Cooper back in 2018, faces a reported budget deficit of upwards of $221 million. This is despite them managing a nearly $1 billion budget. Former NCORE Director Laura Hogshead resigned in the month of November after acknowledging mismanagement before state legislators. Pryor Gibbons, who is a legislative counsel to Governor Roy Cooper, serves as the interim director. NCORE did confirm to the Carolina Journal earlier this week that it did pause issuing new project approvals due to funding constraints. Despite having completed nearly 3,000 homes, there's more than 1,400 homes that remain pending for storms that happened almost a decade ago in the state, with 766 families in the rebuilding process. The agency has also struggled to pay contractors on time, reportedly owing $37.5 million in outstanding invoices, while spending over $2 million a month on temporary housing for displaced individuals as they have completely failed in regards to getting individuals back to their homes. Legislators, including Representative Jake Johnson from Henderson County, have criticized NCORE's inefficiencies, calling for major reforms and increased accountability. Johnson and others have emphasized the need to complete the Eastern North Carolina recovery efforts and, of course, develop a more efficient system going forward. A provision in Senate Bill 382 mandates a state audit of NCORE's financials and performance by mid-2025. Additionally, House Speaker Tim Moore announced a House Select Committee on Helene recovery to address recovery efforts in Western North Carolina. Legislative and federal officials continue to advocate for more robust disaster recovery support from FEMA and Congress. The House Select Committee on Helene Recovery did have a meeting earlier this week. We'll bring you those details coming up on Monday morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Our top story this morning, North Carolina Governor-elect Josh Stein and outgoing Governor Roy Cooper have filed a lawsuit to block portions of Senate Bill 382. This was a law that was passed by the Republican-controlled legislature that does many things, including more than $200 million additional dollars for hurricane relief, moving the State Board of Elections out from the governor and over to the state auditor's office, and also restructures the State Highway Patrol and removes it from the governor's oversight. The law establishes that the SHP commander would now be a cabinet-level position appointed by the legislature and protected from removal by the governor until the year 2030. In the lawsuit filed by both Stein and Cooper, the lawsuit's name is Stein v. Moore, which was filed in Wake County Superior Court, they argue that the law is unconstitutional, undermines public safety, and disrupts the chain of command during emergencies. The two Democrats contend that the changes infringe on executive powers, compromise accountability, and hinder effective crisis response. The lawsuit names House Speaker Tim Moore, Senate Leader Phil Berger, and SHP Commander Freddie Johnson as defendants. The disrupted provisions grant Johnson, appointed by Cooper in 2021, authority over state law enforcement and emergency services until 2030, barring extraordinary circumstances. Stein and Cooper claim this arrangement prevents the governor from ensuring that SHP is in alignment with state priorities. This is one of likely many lawsuits over Senate Bill 382. We'll continue to track the details. That's going to do it for a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back Monday morning at 5 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.